March 9, 1945, 11:47 p.m. The night sky over Tokyo trembled. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Nakamura stood on the roof of the Imperial Naval Technical Research Institute in Meguro Ward, his white gloves gripping the cold iron railing. Below him, the city sprawled in enforced darkness, a blackout so complete that the Sumida River had become invisible, swallowed by the void. The air tasted of charcoal smoke from dinner fires and the faint brine of Tokyo Bay, 15 kilometers to the east. Above, stars punctured the March sky with unusual clarity. Nakamura had been trained to navigate by those stars, to read them as his ancestors had for centuries. He believed, as he had been taught at the Naval Academy in Itajima, that the human spirit, Yamato Damashi, could pierce any darkness, overcome any technological gap, triumph through sheer will and ancestral purity. Then he heard it. Not the wail of air raid sirens, not yet, something else. A sound like distant thunder, but steady, rhythmic, growing. The sound of engines. American engines. B-29 super fortresses, hundreds of them, approaching from the southeast. Nakamura's hands tightened on the railing. His training told him they were still 30, perhaps 40 kilometers away. His training told him Japanese night fighters would intercept them. His training told him that American bombing, high altitude, daylight, aimed at factories was destructive but survivable. His training was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. At 12:15 a.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft released its load, not high-explosive bombs, not the precision munitions American doctrine had relied upon for 3 years of daylight raids. Incendiaries, M69 cluster bombs, each canister splitting open at 2,000 feet to scatter 38 hexagonal tubes filled with jellied gasoline, napalm, across the wooden heart of the world's most densely populated city. Within 18 minutes, 16 square kilometers were ablaze. The firestorm created its own weather, winds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, temperatures reaching 800 degrees Celsius at street level. Nakamura watched his city transform into a vision of hell, rendered with scientific precision. But this story is not about that night. Not directly. This story is about what made that night possible. About a small copper device barely the size of a fist that rewrote the mathematics of warfare and shattered an empire's foundational belief that spirit could defeat science. About the Magnetron and the men who believed they could ignore it. To understand what died in the skies over Tokyo that March night, you must first understand what Japanese military culture had convinced itself was true. In the lecture halls of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, in the training grounds of the Army War College in Tokyo's Ichigaya district, in the strategy rooms where Japan's war was planned and prosecuted, a particular philosophy had calcified into doctrine. It was called seishin kyōiku, spiritual education, and it taught that technological inferiority could be overcome through superior will, through purity of purpose, through the accumulated spiritual strength of an unbroken imperial lineage stretching back 26 centuries. When Japanese officers studied the coming war with America in the late 1930s, they acknowledged the industrial disparity. They knew the United States produced more steel, more oil, more aircraft. The numbers were undeniable, but numbers, they believed, were not destiny. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the architects of Japan's southern offensive, wrote in his operational planning documents that the true strength of the Japanese warrior lies not in his weapons, but in his spirit, tempered by Bushido and purified by service to the emperor. This was not mere propaganda. This was genuine belief encoded into training regimens where soldiers were taught to function on minimal rations, to march beyond exhaustion, to attack fixed positions with bayonets and resolve rather than overwhelming firepower. Japanese pilot training emphasized aerobatic skill, dogfighting prowess, the samurai's code adapted to aerial combat. The Zero fighter, lightweight, maneuverable, stripped of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to maximize performance, embodied this philosophy. The pilot's skill and spirit would compensate for vulnerability. The warrior's resolve would defeat the enemy's material advantage. And for the first 6 months of the Pacific War, it seemed to work. Between December 1941 and June 1942, Japanese forces achieved victories that stunned the world. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered after a campaign that was supposed to take months lasted barely 10 weeks. Burma fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. A defensive perimeter spanning 1/6 of the Earth's surface was seized with losses far lower than Japanese planners had dared hope. In Tokyo, in Osaka, in every provincial city, the victories seemed to validate the doctrine. Spirit had triumphed. The soft, materialistic Americans and British had been routed by warriors who valued honor over comfort, duty over life itself. But even in those early months, careful observers noted something else. Something the victory celebrations obscured. Japanese reconnaissance of American military installations in the Philippines before the war had been thorough. Spies had photographed airfields, counted aircraft, mapped defenses. Yet when Japanese forces landed, they found the Americans had moved faster than expected, reorganized more efficiently than predicted. Radio intercepts that should have been garbled were clear. American naval movements seemed to anticipate Japanese operations with uncanny accuracy. At Coral Sea in May 1942, then catastrophically at Midway in June, American carriers appeared where Japanese planning said they should not be, struck at Japanese carriers with a precision that seemed impossible given the vast empty ocean spaces involved. The answer was invisible. Literally, it operated in wavelengths the human eye could not perceive, and at frequencies Japanese technology could barely detect radar. And at its heart, the cavity magnetron. The story of the magnetron begins not in a weapons laboratory but in a physics department, in the arcane world of microwave research, in the minds of men who were trying to solve an entirely different problem. In February 1940, two British physicists, John Randall and Harry Boot, were working in a cramped laboratory at the University of Birmingham, funded by a government desperate to find better ways to detect incoming German bombers. Existing radar systems worked, but barely. They operated at long wavelengths, meter-long waves, which meant large, cumbersome antennas and relatively poor resolution. You could detect a bomber formation, but not count individual aircraft. You could track a fleet, but not distinguish a destroyer from a cruiser. The Air Ministry wanted something better. Shorter wavelengths, centimeter waves, microwave frequencies that could provide precision, that could be mounted in aircraft, that could guide fighters and anti-aircraft guns with enough accuracy to kill reliably in darkness and clouds. The problem was power. Existing microwave generators produced milliwatts, useful for laboratory experiments, useless for detection at combat ranges. What was needed was a device that could generate kilowatts, thousands of times more powerful at microwave frequencies. Every attempt had failed. Randall and Boot approached the problem differently. Instead of trying to adapt existing vacuum tube technology, they reconsidered the fundamental geometry. They built a circular cavity from a solid block of copper, machined with 6 holes arranged in a ring around a central cathode. When electric current flowed and a magnetic field was applied, electrons spiraled outward, their circular motion generating electromagnetic oscillations at microwave frequencies. The cavity's precise dimensions determined the frequency, naturally resonating like a musical instrument, but instead of sound waves, it produced electromagnetic waves with power densities that made the laboratory's test equipment peg its meters and burn out. On February 21, 1940, the first functional cavity magnetron produced 400 watts at a frequency of 3 gigahertz, a wavelength of 10 centimeters. Within months, refinements pushed the power to kilowatts, then tens of kilowatts. The British had their microwave source. Now they needed to build radar systems around it. But Britain in 1940 was fighting for survival. The Battle of Britain raged that summer. Factories were being bombed. The nation stood alone against Nazi Germany. Its resources stretched to breaking. Britain could invent the technology, but lacked the industrial capacity to mass produce it in the quantities needed. In September 1940, a British technical mission traveled to the United States, carrying with them a cavity magnetron in a wooden box. The Americans were not yet in the war, but they had factories, engineers, industrial capacity that Britain desperately needed. The mission, codenamed Tizard after its leader Sir Henry Tizard, met with American military officials and representatives from MIT. They opened the box. American scientists and engineers looked at the magnetron, this simple-seeming copper cylinder, and immediately grasped its implications. Edward Bowles, an MIT engineer who would later become a key advisor on radar deployment, later wrote, "The Magnetron was the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores." Within weeks, MIT had established the Radiation Laboratory, the RAD Lab, staffed with hundreds of the nation's top physicists and engineers. Their mission: turn the British Magnetron into operational radar systems, mass-producible, reliable, combat-ready. By late 1941, as Japanese forces prepared for their strike on Pearl Harbor, American factories were beginning to produce magnetrons by the thousands. Raytheon, Bell Labs, General Electric, Westinghouse, companies whose names meant consumer products and telephone systems, retooled to manufacture devices that could see through darkness, through clouds, through the fog of war with a precision that would have seemed like magic to commanders a generation earlier. And the Japanese had no idea what was coming. Japan's intelligence services were not incompetent. They had scored significant successes, breaking codes, placing agents, conducting reconnaissance that gave Japanese forces detailed knowledge of Allied dispositions throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But they had a fundamental blind spot, a gap in their understanding shaped by their own technological limitations and doctrinal assumptions. Japanese radar research existed. Engineers at the Naval Technical Research Institute and the Army's Technical Research Institute had developed basic radar systems, some operational by 1941. The Imperial Navy deployed early warning radars at key installations. Japanese night fighters used primitive airborne intercept radar. But the systems were crude by Allied standards. Long wavelength, low power, with poor resolution and reliability. More critically, Japanese military leadership did not prioritize radar development. Resources were funneled to aircraft production, to shipbuilding, to the expansion of conventional forces. Radar was seen as supplementary, a technical curiosity, not a war-winning technology. This was not mere oversight. It reflected a deeper cultural and strategic blindness. Japanese military planning was built around offensive action, decisive engagement, the climactic battle where spirit and skill would determine outcomes. The idea of defensive systems, of passive detection, of using technology to compensate for numerical inferiority, ran counter to doctrinal instincts. When Japanese strategists analyzed American industrial capacity, they focused on tanks, ships, aircraft, things you could count, things that fit traditional categories of military power. The invisible infrastructure of technological warfare, radar networks, radio intelligence, the emerging science of operational coordination enabled by electronic systems, fell outside their conceptual framework. There was also a technical barrier that became a strategic catastrophe. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce precision electronics. The cavity magnetron required machining tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. It required pure copper, specialized vacuum technology, quality control processes that Japanese industry, geared toward heavy manufacturing and mechanical engineering, struggled to achieve. Even when Japanese intelligence obtained information about Allied radar advances, even when captured equipment was analyzed, Japan's industrial base could not replicate the technology at scale. By 1943, this gap had become a chasm. American bombers striking Japanese-held islands in the Pacific were guided to their targets by radar that could distinguish individual buildings from altitude. American submarines prowling Japanese shipping lanes used radar to detect convoys beyond visual range, to attack at night with near impunity. American night fighters found Japanese bombers in complete darkness, closing for kills guided by airborne intercept radar derived from the magnetron. And increasingly, American warships used radar-directed fire control that allowed them to hit Japanese vessels at ranges and in conditions where Japanese optical rangefinders were useless. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, illustrated the disparity with brutal clarity. Japanese carrier aircraft, launched in waves to destroy the American fleet, were detected by radar at ranges exceeding 100 miles. American fighters were vectored to intercept while Japanese strike packages were still forming up. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft that attacked, 330 were destroyed. American losses, 30 aircraft. Japanese pilots, among the most skilled in the world, trained in the spirit over technology doctrine, were slaughtered by a system that saw them coming long before human eyes could detect them, that guided defenders into optimal intercept positions, that turned aerial combat from a test of individual skill into an industrial process of detection, vectoring, and annihilation. But the most devastating application of magnetron-based radar was yet to come, and it required solving a problem that had bedeviled strategic bombing since the beginning of the war: how to hit targets you cannot see. The United States Army Air Forces began bombing Japan in June 1944, operating from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber in the world, capable of carrying massive bomb loads at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. American doctrine called for precision daylight bombing, hitting factories, ports, military installations with high-explosive bombs dropped from high altitude using the Norden bomb site, a sophisticated optical device that in theory allowed for accuracy measured in meters. In practice, it didn't work. Japan's weather made precision bombing nearly impossible. The jet stream, a river of high altitude, wind that Japanese meteorologists had been studying since the 1920s, but that American planners did not fully understand, blasted across Japan at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour during winter months. Bombers approaching at 30,000 feet were buffeted by winds that made the Norden bomb site's calculations meaningless. Cloud cover obscured targets 7 days out of 10. Of the first months of high-altitude precision bombing, less than 10% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of their aim points. Entire missions dropped their loads on cloud-covered cities with no idea what, if anything, they had hit. The American strategic bombing campaign against Japan was failing. Tens of thousands of tons of munitions expended, hundreds of aircraft and crew lost to Japanese defenses and operational accidents, negligible impact on Japan's war production. Then in January 1945, a decision was made that would rewrite the rules. Major General Curtis LeMay, newly appointed commander of WW2 Bomber Command, analyzed the failure of precision bombing and concluded that American doctrine was wrong, not because the targets were wrong, but because the method was impossible. High-altitude daylight precision bombing could not work in Japan's meteorological conditions. A different approach was needed. LeMay proposed low-altitude night incendiary attacks. The logic was brutal and efficient. Japanese cities were constructed primarily of wood and paper. Centuries of building tradition, compounded by resource scarcity during the war, meant that even in Tokyo and Osaka, the great majority of structures were wooden. Fire was the ancient enemy, the destroyer that had ravaged Japanese cities repeatedly throughout history, and now American industry had perfected incendiary weapons. The M69, a hexagonal tube filled with jellied gasoline that burst on impact, spreading burning gel that stuck to surfaces and could not be extinguished with water. But there was still the problem of accuracy. How do you hit specific districts in a blacked-out city at night from altitudes where optical bomb sites are useless? The answer was the H2X radar. Developed at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, the H2X was an airborne ground-mapping radar using magnetron technology to generate microwave pulses that reflected off buildings, rivers, coastlines, off the very topography of the Earth below. The returning echoes were displayed on a scope in the bombardier's station, creating a radar image of the ground that could be seen through clouds, through darkness, through smoke. An operator trained to read the radar returns could identify cities, distinguish industrial districts from residential areas, guide an entire bomber formation to a target area, with precision measured in hundreds of meters, not kilometers. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s took off from bases in the Marianas. They carried over 2,000 tons of M69 incendiary clusters. Their orders were to destroy 16 square kilometers of eastern Tokyo, the densely packed districts of Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa, where small workshops and cottage industries produce components for Japan's war machine, intermixed with residential neighborhoods housing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Lead Pathfinder aircraft, equipped with H2X radar, went in first, flying at 6,000 feet, low enough to improve radar resolution, low enough to avoid the worst of the jet stream. Bombardiers watched their scopes, matching the radar return of the Sumida River's distinctive bend with their target maps. When the river's curve aligned with the crosshairs, they released their loads. Incendiaries tumbled into the darkness, bursting open, scattering fire across a grid of wooden buildings. Following bombers homed in on the flames, but also on their own H-2X returns, coordinating drops to create an interlocking pattern of fire that would trap residents in an expanding inferno. The attack was not random. It was geometrically calculated, each bomber's payload placed to maximize the probability that individual fires would merge into a firestorm, a conflagration so intense it would create its own weather, its own inward-rushing winds, its own physics of destruction. At 12:15 a.m., the first incendiaries fell. By 1:30 a.m., 16 square kilometers were ablaze. Fires so intense that B-29 crews at 6,000 feet reported their aircraft being buffeted by thermals, the smell of burning flesh reaching them inside sealed cockpits. Winds generated by the firestorm reached hurricane force, pulling people off their feet into the flames. The Sumida River boiled. People who jumped in seeking safety were cooked alive. Those who huddled in supposed fire breaks, parks, wide boulevards died when radiant heat from surrounding fires created ovens in open spaces. By dawn, approximately 100,000 people were dead. 1 million were homeless. 16 square kilometers of urban Tokyo had been erased, reduced to ash and rubble. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history. More deadly than the Dresden firebombing, more deadly than either atomic bomb would be 5 months later. And it had been made possible by a copper cylinder the size of a fist, generating microwave pulses, allowing bombardiers to see through darkness and deliver fire with scientific precision. In the weeks following the Tokyo firestorm, Lieutenant Commander Nakamura was tasked with investigating what had happened, how the Americans had achieved such devastating accuracy. He examined reports from surviving air defense units. He reviewed intercepts of American radio communications. He studied reconnaissance, photographs of the burn patterns. What he found filled him with a creeping dread that had nothing to do with the horror of the casualties and everything to do with the realization of what it meant. The burn patterns were not random. They were geometric. A grid, precisely laid, demonstrating that the Americans had bombed exactly where they intended to bomb at night, through blackout conditions, with an accuracy that should have been impossible. Air defense reports noted that American bombers had approached at unusually low altitude, that radar returns had been detected, but were confused by jamming and by sheer numbers of aircraft. The few night fighters that made contact reported the bombers seemed to know they were coming, taking evasive action before visual contact was possible. Nakamura understood radar theory. He had studied the reports from captured Allied equipment. He knew the Imperial Navy's own radar systems could barely detect surface ships at useful ranges. That airborne radar was still experimental, unreliable. He knew that Japanese industry was struggling to produce even basic radar sets in sufficient numbers. And now he was confronting evidence that the Americans had deployed radar systems so advanced, so capable, that they had fundamentally changed the nature of aerial warfare. He wrote in his report, later recovered from Japanese archives, "The enemy possesses technological capabilities that render our defensive doctrine obsolete. Their ability to navigate and target in conditions of total darkness and cloud cover suggests detection apparatus of a sophistication we cannot match. This is not merely a gap in specific technologies, but a systemic difference in approach. The enemy has weaponized precision itself." The symbolism was crushing. For decades, Japanese military culture had taught that spirit, willpower, and traditional warrior virtues could overcome material disadvantages. That the purity of purpose inherent in serving the emperor, in embodying Bushido, would allow Japanese forces to defeat enemies who relied on technology rather than character. The Zero fighter had been designed around this philosophy. Light, maneuverable, flown by pilots whose skill would overcome any deficiency in protection or firepower. But you cannot dogfight radar. You cannot will your way past microwave pulses traveling at the speed of light. You cannot summon ancestral spirits to cloud a bombardier's H-2X scope. What died over Tokyo that March night was not just 100,000 people. It was the foundational myth of Japanese military ideology, incinerated as thoroughly as the wooden districts of the capital. There is a mathematics to warfare that military cultures sometimes refuse to acknowledge. Wars are won by logistics, by industrial capacity, by the ability to deploy overwhelming resources at decisive points. But there is also a subtler mathematics, the geometry of information, the calculus of prediction and detection, that determines who sees whom first, who strikes from beyond the range of retaliation, who turns uncertainty into calculable risk. The cavity magnetron did not win the Pacific War by itself. American industrial production, code-breaking, submarine warfare, and the sheer scale of resources mobilized were all essential. But the magnetron was the enabling technology that turned industrial capacity into precision, that allowed American forces to operate inside Japanese decision cycles, to see farther, strike more accurately, coordinate more effectively than an enemy that had convinced itself that technology was secondary to spirit. Consider the numbers. By war's end, American factories had produced more than 1 million radar sets, ranging from small airborne units to massive ground installations. These radars, nearly all employing magnetron technology, guided night fighters to their targets, allowed ships to navigate and fight in total darkness, directed anti-aircraft fire with accuracy that made low-altitude attacks suicidal, and permitted bombers to destroy Japanese cities with a precision that killed more civilians in the last 6 months of the war than all previous bombing campaigns combined. Japanese production of radar sets in the same period, approximately 10,000, most using outdated long-wavelength technology, produced in small batches by workshops that lacked the tools and expertise for mass production of precision electronics. It was not that Japanese engineers were less capable. Captured documents and post-war interviews reveal that Japanese researchers understood magnetron principles, that laboratory prototypes existed. But understanding is not enough. Warfare at industrial scale requires the ability to manufacture complex technologies by the thousands, to train operators to integrate new systems into doctrine and tactics, to adapt faster than the enemy adapts. Japan's industrial base, already stretched beyond capacity, could not make the leap. There is a particular tragedy in this for Japanese forces who fought with extraordinary courage and skill, who endured conditions of deprivation that would have broken less disciplined armies, who held positions long past the point where retreat would have been militarily sensible. Their valor was real. Their sacrifices were genuine. And all of it was rendered increasingly irrelevant by an enemy that could see them coming, that could strike before they could respond, that turned warfare from a contest of will into an equation of detection ranges and radar cross-sections. By the summer of 1945, Japan's cities were burning. American bombers roamed at will, their losses minimal, their targeting precise enough to shift from indiscriminate area bombing to the systematic destruction of remaining war industries and transportation infrastructure. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, themselves deliverable with confidence because escort fighters, vectored by radar, had achieved air superiority that made daylight navigation possible, were the exclamation point on a sentence that had been written months earlier. That sentence read, "Precision defeats spirit. Information dominance trumps willpower. The side that sees farther strikes more accurately, and adapts faster will win, regardless of how fervently the losing side believes otherwise." After the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interviewed Japanese military officials, engineers, and civilian leaders. The testimony is revealing, not just in what it says about the efficacy of specific weapons, but in the psychological impact of facing an enemy whose technological sophistication seemed almost supernatural. One Japanese naval officer, speaking anonymously, described the experience. "We were taught that American soldiers were soft, that they relied on machines because they lacked spiritual strength. We believed this because we needed to believe it. The alternative was to accept that we were fighting an enemy we could never defeat. When we began to understand the extent of their technological advantage, particularly in radar and electronics, it felt as though the fundamental rules of warfare had been changed without our knowledge. We had brought swords to a gunfight and convinced ourselves the swords were superior because of the honor they represented." The magnetron in this context was more than a component in a radar system. It became a symbol, a physical manifestation of a different approach to warfare, one that valued precision over passion, calculation over courage, the mastery of natural law over appeals to supernatural will. American forces did not lack courage. The men who flew B-29s through flak and fighter attacks, who stormed beaches at Saipan and Iwo Jima, who sailed into kamikaze attacks in the waters off Okinawa, their bravery was beyond question. But American military culture had long since accepted that bravery alone was insufficient, that technology was not a substitute for spirit, but a multiplier of human capability. The Magnetron represented that philosophy made real, a device that extended human senses into the invisible spectrum, that allowed operators to impose order on chaos, to see through the fog of war literally and metaphorically. For Japanese forces, trained to view technology as secondary, the Magnetron's impact was philosophically devastating. Each night raid that appeared from nowhere, each ship sunk by submarines that detected them beyond visual range, each fighter vectored to an interception that should have been impossible. These were not just tactical defeats. They were challenges to the entire conceptual framework that justified the war, that explained why Japan could hope to prevail against an enemy with 10 times its industrial capacity. The answer was supposed to be spirit. The answer was supposed to be that spiritual strength, properly cultivated, could overcome material weakness. But how do you cultivate spiritual strength against an enemy that can see you in total darkness, that can guide bombs through clouds to land within meters of their target, that has weaponized the electromagnetic spectrum itself? There was no answer. Or rather, the answer was the one Japanese leadership refused to accept until cities had burned and atomic bombs had fallen. You cannot. Spirit matters. Courage matters. But against an enemy that has achieved information dominance through technological superiority, spirit is not enough. It was never enough. In the decades after the war, historians have debated the morality of the incendiary campaigns, the necessity of the atomic bombs, the strategic calculus that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. These are important questions, essential questions, deserving of rigorous examination and ethical scrutiny. But separate from the moral questions is a historical truth about the nature of technological change in warfare. The cavity magnetron, developed by two physicists trying to solve a detection problem, mass-produced by companies whose pre-war business was light bulbs and radios, deployed in systems that made darkness transparent and clouds irrelevant, fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Pacific War. It did not do so, obviously. The magnetron did not appear in propaganda posters. It was not celebrated in newsreels the way fighters and bombers were. Most American civilians had no idea what a cavity magnetron was, how it worked, or why it mattered. Even many military personnel who benefited from radar systems did not understand the technology underlying them. They just knew that the scope showed contacts, that the vectors were accurate, that what had been uncertain was now predictable, that invisibility is itself significant. The most decisive technologies are often those that operate beneath notice, that create enabling conditions for other, more visible capabilities. The magnetron did not sink ships or shoot down aircraft directly, but it made possible the systems that did. It transformed guesswork into geometry, uncertainty into calculated probability. For Japanese observers like Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, who survived the war and later became a professor of naval history, the magnetron came to represent a lesson learned too late. That technological sophistication is not merely a matter of producing more weapons, but of creating systems that leverage natural laws more effectively than the enemy. That information, when weaponized, is as decisive as firepower. That the side which measures reality more precisely can impose its will more effectively. He wrote, in a memoir published in 1967, "We believed we were fighting a war of spirits. We did not realize we were actually fighting a war of spectrums, electromagnetic, informational, industrial. The Americans mastered those spectrums while we were still arguing about whether spiritual purity could compensate for inferior numbers. By the time we understood our error, our cities were ash." There is one more element to this story, a final irony that speaks to the complexity of technological development and historical memory. After the war, Japanese industry rebuilt with a focus on precision electronics, on miniaturization, on quality control processes that had been lacking during the war years. Companies like Sony, Toshiba, Mitsubishi Electric became global leaders in consumer electronics, in precision manufacturing, in technologies that required exactly the kind of industrial sophistication that wartime Japan had lacked. Some of those engineers had worked on wartime radar projects. Some had examined captured American equipment. Some had lived through the firebombings and emerged determined that Japan would never again lag in technological capability. In a very real sense, the lesson of the Magnetron was absorbed, internalized, and became part of Japan's post-war economic miracle. The nation that had believed spirit could overcome technology became one of the world's leading technological powers, not by abandoning discipline or cultural values, but by recognizing that those values could be expressed through mastery of technology rather than opposition to it. The cavity magnetron itself became obsolete within decades, replaced by newer technologies, by solid-state devices, by digital systems that made World War II-era radar look primitive. But the principle it embodied, that mastery of the electromagnetic spectrum, that precision in measurement and calculation, that the ability to see farther and strike more accurately is decisive, that principle remains foundational to modern warfare. Every stealth aircraft, every precision-guided munition, every satellite reconnaissance system, every drone strike conducted from continents away descends intellectually from the same recognition that drove magnetron development. Information dominance is force multiplier, that reducing uncertainty is a weapon in itself. And for those who still believe that spirit alone can prevail, that willpower and courage can substitute for technological parity, history offers a harsh lesson written in fire over Tokyo, in the radar returns that guided bombers through darkness, in the copper cavity that made precision itself a weapon. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice, heard for the first time by most Japanese citizens via radio broadcast, announced acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. The word surrender was not used. The language was archaic, indirect, speaking of enduring the unendurable and accepting a peace that would preserve the national polity. But the meaning was clear. Japan had lost. In the years of occupation and reconstruction that followed, American technical teams examined Japanese military research facilities. They found magnetron prototypes, radar designs, evidence of research programs that understood the principles but lacked the industrial capacity to execute at scale. They found documents outlining tactical awareness of Allied radar superiority, recommendations for countermeasures, desperate proposals for crash programs to close the gap. They found all of it too little, too late. One captured document, a technical report dated April 1945, a month after the Tokyo firestorm, analyzed recovered fragments of American H-2X radar equipment. The anonymous Japanese engineer who wrote it demonstrated sophisticated understanding of magnetron operation, of waveguide design, of the challenges in building centimetric radar. His conclusion was stark. To produce this device in quantities sufficient for military deployment would require industrial capacity we do not possess, precision manufacturing we have not mastered, and materials we cannot obtain. Even if we solved these problems, training operators and integrating the technology into our forces would require years we do not have. We are fighting an enemy whose invisible weapons have already won the war. That document, now preserved in archives, is a fitting epitaph for the ideology that spirit alone could prevail. The engineer who wrote it understood, with the clarity that comes from defeat, that his side had been fighting on the wrong terms. That courage and discipline, while necessary, were not sufficient. That the Americans had fought a different kind of war, one where the invisible spectrum of radio waves mattered as much as the visible courage of soldiers, where precision engineering was as decisive as tactical daring. The magnetron did not win the war alone, but it enabled victory in ways that made traditional martial valor increasingly irrelevant. It allowed American forces to see through darkness, to strike through clouds, to turn uncertainty into calculable risk. It embodied a philosophy of warfare that Japanese military culture had rejected, that mastery of natural law, that precision in measurement and application of force, that technological sophistication integrated into doctrine and mass-produced by industry could overcome any amount of spiritual conviction. And in the ruins of Tokyo, in the ashes of Osaka and Nagoya and 50 other cities, in the survivors who had watched their world burn with geometric precision, the lesson was learned in fire and death: spirit matters. Courage matters. Discipline and honor and sacrifice matter, but against an enemy that has weaponized precision itself, that has turned the invisible spectrum into a battlefield, and mastered it with a copper cylinder and the laws of physics, spirit is not enough, it was never enough. The Magnetron proved that.